Excuse me, sir. Himangi?
Yes.
Yeah, we are live on YouTube now, and I've started recording the session. We may begin now.
Okay. Hello and good evening to one and all. I, Himangi Yadav, an undergraduate student of B.N.N.College. I'm your host for today, the 10th day of our 15 days national level e-workshop on UGC NET JRF in English. This workshop is organized by the Department of English and IQAC cell of B.N.N.College. Yes, sorry.
Himangi, your video is off.
My video is off?
Yes. Please start it again.
Sir, my video is on. I am not.
Now.
Is it fine, sir, now?
Yes.
And I am audible, right?
Yes.
You are.
Okay, so should I begin again? Okay.
Please.
So, yeah. Hello and good evening to one and all. I, Himangi Yadav, an undergraduate student of B.N.N.College. I'm your host for today, the 10th day of our 15 days national level e-workshop on UGC NET JRF in English. This workshop is organized by the Department of English and IQAC cell of B.N.N.College. I would like to extend my gratitude to our organizers, Dr. Ashok Wagh, Principal of B.N.N.College, Dr. Sudhir Nikam, Head of Department and Chairman, Board of Studies in English, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Shashikant Malunkar, Professor B.K. Paikrao, and Professor Rajni Wagmare, that they made this program successful. This workshop is organized on the occasion of the centenary celebration of the birth anniversary of Shri Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav. The present e-workshop aims to invite different experts across the country as speakers on an online platform to motivate and guide the UGC NET aspirants and to introduce the best strategies involved in cracking the exam. So I welcome you all again. So our guest speaker for day 10 today is Mr. Apurva Shahi. He is a full-time PhD research scholar in English literature from Jivaji University in Gwalior. He is also a part of teaching associate of Amity School of Languages, Amity University, Gwalior. Mr. Shahi has extensive knowledge of linguistics, classical British literature, American literature, and grammar conventions. He has also actively participated in conferences and professional research. He delivers lectures and facilitates classroom discussions on analysis, rhetoric, critical theory, structure, and style. He has participated in campus events, including National Novel Writing Month and Black History Month. It is an honor to have you with us, sir. And now, without taking much of this precious time, I would like Mr. Shahi to proceed further with the event. Over to you, sir.
Many thanks, Himangi. I'd like to show my heartiest congratulations to all the designated guests who have invited me on this platform, especially Dr. Sudhir Nikam and the IQSL and obviously the B.N.N.College. In today's lecture, what we'll be discussing about in terms of is obviously the concept, the technicalities that we'll be discussing in terms of language, basic concept and theories, pedagogy, and English and news. I've already made a PPT related to that, so that what will be the best strategy in terms of cracking the UGC NET JRF examination when it comes to basic concept and theories of pedagogy, and obviously the technicalities that basically comes in terms of, let's say, linguistics or in terms of English and users. Allow me to present the PPT, and then we'll have a in-depth discussion related to this topic. I hope the screen is visible to all of you. So obviously, from very in terms of language, concepts, and theories. So first of all, we have to understand like what is language and how it has originated. Most of the times, in the recent pattern that we have discussed in terms of, let's say, in terms of UGC NET JRF examination. Earlier, the questions usually comes in a very straightforward manner, very basic when it comes to, let's say, language and its pedagogy. But however, in the recent days, in terms of cracking the UGC NET and JRF examinations, you have to go to the in-depth, the technicalities of it, how it has evolved, what's the origin of it, how all those different branches of languages, be it come terms of, let's say, Indo-European language, with terms of, let's say, Scandinavian languages, comes into play. These all play a very vital role in terms of, let's say, in having a concept's clarity and obviously the notions associated with it. Let me give you an example of how to have it. Just a minute. Is the slide visible to all of you?
Yes, sir. The screen is visible, but I suggest you turn your video off as long as you're sharing the screen so that
Sure.
the lag
Sure.
goes away.
Yeah. So obviously, in terms of, let's say, in terms of language origin and all, obviously the first notion that comes into play is how the English language has evolved over the period of time. We all being the student of English literature, and we already know that is dated back to, let's say, the 14th century with the East Midland dialect and all. But in order to crack the UGC NET examination, we have to understand the different branches. We'll be discussing about different components about phonology, about Pidgin, Creole, and different other technicalities also over the period of time. But first of all, you have to understand how the which is back to the 5,000 year ago. And obviously the concept of Germanic origin, like in the today's scenario, if you just see to the regions which are basically of the regions of, let's say, Iceland or Norwegian or Swedish, mostly the Scandinavian nations, that becomes a very prominent part in terms of, let's say, Indo-European languages. And obviously how even language is important in those perspectives. We all been studied about linear and Shannon and Weaver model of communication. I'll be discussing about that also. So whenever we are discussing about, let's say, in terms of, let's say, language communication, or let's say in terms of why even language is important at the first place, and why it has been incorporated into the UGC NET syllabus. For that, you already have to understand that in terms of any communication skills, few things always come to play. Obviously, in terms of Shannon and Weaver model of communication, we all been knowing this fact that obviously we have a sender, we have an encoder, we have a medium of channel, we have a receiver, and then subsequently goes on. And there are different technicalities in terms of barriers of communication and different other types and modules of channels. But the key emphasis here is not about how different types of channels or barriers of communication comes into play. My key emphasis is on why at the first place we need language. Because in order to transmit any information, let's say any data, you need some kind of encoded information there. And for that, you always need a language at the first place. Be it any language, be it even sign, let's say verbal, non-verbal language, that also come into the play. So coming to the next one, obviously, first lingua franca and obviously the Pidgin. Obviously, in terms of, let's say, Pidgin or lingua franca, the first thing that you understand is the concept of what is the Alvan language and what is the Altan language. Obviously, lingua franca comes into play, which is used for the most common base in terms of communication. In the way we all know that obviously language has been not genetically acquired, rather than has been culturally acquired. I'll give you one concrete example to prove my point. Like suppose if a child is born in India, now after let's say 2 to 3 years of age, has been recepted to Germany. Obviously, over the subsequent period of time, that child was eventually will start speaking German language. It shows that obviously language is not genetically acquired, it's culturally acquired. So obviously in the lingua franca comes into play the most, as a common way of, let's say, communication that happens between two or more than two modes of communication in a common general area. Pidgin basically happen in terms of those language. It's a kind of, let's say, new simplified form of language that already exists in terms of, let's say, lingua franca. And just to have a notions where, let's say, how all those pigeons simplify or let's say become we comprehend the entire technicalities of, let's say, any complex language that comes into the role of, let's say, picture. Whenever, let's say, we acquire any language, I like to, put a key emphasis on this fact. Imagine how we first acquired our L1 language. Obviously, let's say in any speak, let's say Hindi, English, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, or any other languages. First, we have culturally acquired from our families, from our society, from our neighbors. And then we have acquired to the other ones. And then we have the L2 language. We'll be discussing about different forms also, about grammar translation method, the direct method, and subsequently other things also. But the notion about how those cultural affiliations, valuations, that design, that socially engineered our brain. We all know with the fact of, let's say, LED, that is called language acquisition device. It's given by a most prominent, thinker named Noam Chomsky. What is the LED? LED clearly put an emphasis on the fact that suppose if a child is born, let's say, from the age of 0 to 14, his LED is most active. He can, if he's been, exposed to the multiple languages, multiple domain, multiple cultural valuations, he'll start speaking multiple languages. Now, let me give you an example of that. Now, suppose if a person is, let's say, at the border region of, let's say, Bengal and Assam, they'll start speaking both Assamese and Bengali language at the same point of time. Have you ever thought that why, let's say, while acquiring after the age of 14, let's say, why we have, let's say, difficulties in terms of learning the L2 language or the L3 languages? Like if you start learning, let's say, Arabic, French, German, Russian, anything, let's say, in terms of L2 language, you always have tough time understanding the syntactical structure, the conjugation, let's say the personal pronouns, the accusative case, the dative case of the entire grammar. Because in that case, we are already bound with the notions, with the norms, with the syntactical structure, with the grammatical structure of our L1 language. And our cognitive domain is not ready to accept, let's say, to the L2 language. So always have a lag. We call it as language lag. Because most of the times when we, let's say, think about anything, let's say we think about any other object or let's say any other idea, we always think in the L1 language. Then we go to the L2 language. Why there is a language lag at the first point of time? Most of the times it is the most challenging topic in terms of ELT also. Like why whenever we acquire, let's say, L2 language, why still we are not very comfortable with that notions? The very simple answer to that fact is that obviously, whenever we acquire, let's say, to the L2 language, we always think in our L1 language. We translate, we decomprehend, and then we start articulating it. The time, the duration, the notion that exists in terms of all those conversion from L1 and L2 language create a lag in between. And that's create one of the very basic fundamental barriers in terms of communicating with others. So in terms of, let's say, pidgin and lingua franca, pidgin is more like which simplified, or let's say, which eradicate all those notions of different syntactical structure, or let's say semantical, grammatical rules, discarded it. It's desimplified the entire notion so that a general mode of communication can be existed between two or different set of peoples. That's one of the very major factor. And even in terms of, let's say, process of language acquisition, I've just been, putting key emphasis on the fact that we have the structures, the rules, and the representations. Obviously, we all know that in terms of any language, we always have different notions: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. But the very fundamental idea that you always have to go through the notion of the fact is that how those syntactical, semantical, or let's say even the pragmatical meanings comes into play in our cognitive domain. Have you ever thought, let's say, whichever your L1 languages, has you ever first understand, learned, decoded, decomprehended in your schools, or you first acquired it with your family or with your, let's say, kith and kins, obviously with your families and your kith and kins, with your society. The society has taught you the first and the fundamental notions. Then you move to the schools, then you obviously have a well-defined grammatical structure, the syntactical structure, you notice it, you get an expertise on that, and then you just move on. So acquisitions always comes into play into role way before whenever even our cognitive domain has developed to its full competency. Even in L1 language, we have different set of notions and rules that always comes into play. Again, I like to put a key emphasis on the fact, like suppose even if you acquire the L2 language, language. Now, let's say, suppose I'll give you my example. In my student days, I used to acquire, let's say, L2 language as French as my compulsory paper. Then I acquired soft skill as a Russian language. But still, despite the notion of learning both the French and the Russian language, I still, after so many period of time, still have difficulties in terms of comprehending those French and Russian languages, slangs, the common languages. Why that barrier exists? Obviously, the notions in terms of, let's say, L1 language doesn't apply to the L2 language. Why? Because in L1 language, you have a very in-depth notion about the appropriate use of idiomatic expressions, correctness of language, obviously the natural pronunciation, and obviously the cultural context including with it. Now, suppose how the cultural context is important. In each and every language, we have different notions. We have different, let's say, meanings, different slangs, different other, coded words, which obviously go beyond the meaning of grammatical structure. Now, suppose if you start learning L2 language in terms of that perspective, obviously you will be stepped out of all those notions and barriers. So obviously the appropriate use of idiomatic expressions, languages, at the same point of time, natural pronunciation, cultural context, and obviously the use of vocabulary. That's a very important point. Let me go through it. I'll again ask to all of you, like, when did you start having this notion that you have enough vocabulary in your cognitive state where you don't need any other new words in order to communicate the language? It generally happens at the age of, let's say, 14, 15, or 16, where you have enough vocabulary to communicate to your different fellow kith and kins, to your society. And there you start acquiring new words. If you ever started having a notions about how, let's say, a child speak, how child forms the languages, or let's say, if you have ever observed the notions, those unfortunate childs who has been, let's say, diagnosed with dyslexia or something. The problem with the, let's say, the spatially able child who's suffering from dyslexia is always have the notion is fail to have that entire notion of syntactical structure in his cognitive domain. That's why he's unable to speak the language correctly. The same happens with, let's say, in terms of those who are speaking, those who are in the early, let's say, 8 or 9 or 10. If you closely observe how the child articulates, speak, structure, design the entire thing, that's very different from in terms of the way we adult and the grown-up speak. Obviously, the child, when he's speaking, he doesn't have the notion, he doesn't have the cognitive ability to understand the contextual or the cultural meaning associated with it, or the pragmatical meaning, I'll say. But over the period of time, over the period of situation, the social affiliation, the valuation, the affirmations, to understand that which words should be used in which context at which point of time. And that's why we always have a notion into mind that obviously the entire structure is obviously, the language is dynamic in nature. Why the language is dynamic in nature? I can prove my point with a very simple notion. We all been studying about the synchronic and diachronic study of language. I'll be coming to that point also. Now, what is synchronic study of language? When you study a particular language at one particular point of time, the key characters, features, the evaluations, the structure, the use of representations of the entire formulations of any particular language, that comes into play at one particular point of time. That's come to the synchronic study of language. What is the diachronic study of language? When you study the entire language over the period of time. Now, I'll again prove my point with a very simple one word. Now, suppose if you ever use the word, let's say, gay, and let's say in the Victorian era, or let's say in the new classical era, it loosely represents to the fact that you are feeling very optimistic, you are happy today, you are feeling positive. Now, in today's scenario, the word very gay symbolized to the queer audience, to the LGBT community. Giving you the next example. Now, if you even use the word, let's say, handsome, the word handsome, usually into the let's say late Victorian or in the late new classical ages, usually been represented for the females, for the female beauties. Now it has been usually attributed to the male ones. It's always dynamic in nature. It's always keep on changing. in the most of the times in the recent generation, we have the generation Z, those who are born, let's say, after 1995. They have different sort of abbreviations, slangs, coded words. All these have acquired over the formulation of the Alban language. And obviously the cross-cultural valuation always comes into the play. So that's the process of language acquisition in that point of time. And then we have L2 language and obviously the multilingualism. I already have given an example of that. Suppose in terms of, let's say, even if we just focus on the factor of, let's say, LADs. Now, LADs plays a very important role. Now, just earlier I've given you the example that suppose if a person is less exposed to multiple languages before the age of 14, or let's say he have a multicultural family who speaks, let's say, 2, 3, or 4 languages, it by default be acquiring all those languages at the same level, being fluent in all those factors. And obviously that's from the role of multilingualism and multicultural perspective. Obviously the acquisition of language has to be in terms of natural process. The natural process, or let's say the natural acquisitions, will definitely define all the syntactical or the complex grammatical rules that comes into play in a very easy manner in our cognitive domain. So these factors do plays a very prominent role in terms of, let's say, in terms of acquiring L2 or multilingualism, or let's say in terms of any L3 or L4 language. These plays a very dominant role there. Now, if you ever try to learn, let's say, L3, L4, even let's say L2 language, or let's say even if you have even try to learn any of the languages, the most prominent difficulty where you have is the terms of the one grammatical rules that you follow in the L1 language doesn't apply on the L2 language. And again, there you comes the formation of the lag there. I won't go into the technicalities of those signifier and signified concept, but still the notions that exist with the fact that when you start thinking our idea, valuation, object, all those notions into one particular language in which we want to speak, the lag by default get eradicated. But if we start having the notions where we first convert into the L1 language, then we convert into the to the L2 language, then we articulate, and then we form into some kind of syntactical structure. There always will be a lag there that exists predominantly there. So that creates a very fundamental barriers there in terms of multilingualism, or less than acquiring L2 language. And obviously different linguistics component or linguistics features that comes into play in acquiring any languages. Now, I won't go into the very technicalities of, let's say, what are the different key features of linguistics. That's a completely different genre and different field. But still, to have a basic notions, we all know with the fact that there are 26 letters, but there are 44 sounds in English languages. 44 sounds. We have bilabial, we have fricative, arovalar, glottal. We have different vowel sounds also, diphthongs also. We have nasal sounds. So all these sounds, whenever let's say we are acquiring any languages, the first notion that you have to keep in mind is that any language is formed out of 5 different components. Be any language. At the most fundamental is the phonology, from where come the phonemes. These are the smallest unit of sounds. It doesn't have any meaning associated with it, but it does have sounds, different sounds, fricative, affricate, vowels, semi-vowels, stops, nasals. All these comes into play. And when these phonemes combine together to form some kind of meaningful word, that comes under morphology, or we call it morphemes. Even morphemes have different subcomponent also, free morpheme and bound morphemes. That's a very different perspective, but again, just to have a notion on that factor. In terms of phonology or phoneme, we don't have any meaning associated with it, be it any language. But when it comes to morphology, we have some meaningful articulation. What is free morpheme? That exists on its own, that has its own independent meaning. Now, suppose if I say the word faithful, so the faithful can exist on its own. It has its own meaning associated with it. Now, suppose if I just add the word un into it, unfaithful, the entire meaning got changed. So the word un is a bound morpheme there. It can't exist on its own. It doesn't have any meaning on its own. It has to have the help, it has to have the existence of the notions attached with a free morpheme. Bound morpheme can't exist on its own. It doesn't have meaning associated. Generally, the notion exists with the terms of, let's say, prefixes and suffixes there. So that comes under the role of morphology. In the quick glance, we always have syntax, semantics, and the pragmatics, the rules of the grammar, the structure, and all those syntactical structure that comes into play, the accusative, the dative case, the conjugation that it comes into play. Now, in terms of acquiring many languages, in the subsequent slides, we'll be going into the notions about how those syntactical, semantical structures comes into play whenever we are acquiring language in terms of, let's say, grammar translation method or direct method there. But obviously the semantical, let's say in terms of syntactical structure, these grammatical rules or abbreviations to come into play in terms of whenever you are trying to articulate any fundamental languages there. Obviously, then the divine version comes after that is the semantics. Let me deconstruct and desimplify the entire notions. So phonology, we have a very smallest single unit of sound which doesn't have any meaningful meanings associated with it. And when these different sounds, let's say fricative, alveolar, or bilabial, labial combine together to form some kind of meaningful word, we have morphology. And when these morphology combine together to form some kind of meaningful and present, that comes under syntax. And then we obviously have the literal meaning that is associated with it. The conceptual, the consideration, the grammar, the vocabulary, the conceptual meaning of a word, that comes under the rules of semantics. And obviously the pragmatics goes beyond those notions. But obviously you have the relationship between different languages and the cultural affiliation, the valuations, all those factors comes into play. So in terms of pragmatics, we have different, which goes beyond literal meaning associated with it. So these notions comes a very direct, affirmation in terms of, let's say, acquiring any languages too. And obviously we have the lang and parole associated with those notions. We all are familiar with the two very famous linguists named Ferdinand de Saussure and Noam Chomsky. We already been aware, or let me give a brief glimpse of that. We have a prescriptive grammar also, and we have a descriptive grammar also. Lang and parole are very different notions associated with it. That is called language versus speech, which is very important. In terms of, let's say, LSRW, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, which is the most prominent one. Obviously, the universal grammar, or less in terms of linguistic competency, these notions comes into play. Now, don't get confused with semiological system. I'll desimplify these notions also in a very simpler manner. But all those lang and parole, this lang is more like the set of rules and regulation that correspond to the meaning of a one particular language. But how you express it in reality. Now, I'll give you my example in that. Now, suppose in the region, let's say, suppose you are born and brought in a particularly Hindi belt there. Have you ever observed that most of the times, even while speaking, let's say in my case, let's say my L1 language is Hindi, we never speak truly, or let's say to the full competency of the full articulation of Hindi language's word in our L1 language. We always mix us with English or some other words. That's the notion that exists. That's the dilution theory there that exists into play. Obviously, we have a notion that whenever you are articulating, let's say, any languages, be it like anyone, let's say L1, or let's say in any languages, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Marathi, any languages you speak, you always have a certain set of rules and regulations that you always have to abide by it. But in terms of parole, we by default, when we speak, we articulate, we express, these notions get diluted, have different applications, so you have different utterances. And it's always changes or have some kind of application in terms of the cultural valuations in which a person is particularly being born and brought up, who say a language, who have a certain utterances or attempt. And that's why even with this notions, we'll be discussing about different tone, dialect, and intonations also. That also plays a very prominent role there. Why these factors becomes a very important notions associated with it? Because in terms of, let's say, lang, we always have some kind of notion that in a particular language, you have to speak in a particular syntactical structure, a particular grammatical rules, a particular kind of syntactical structure, the norm. Now, let's suppose if you're learning, let's say, Alpine language as English, the very basic component you need is three forms, that is SVO, subject, verb, and objective. But let's say suppose when you are basically articulating it, sometimes you always discard or let's say dissociate yourself with the proper grammatical rules. But by default, your meaning should be conveyed there. It doesn't matter you are following the exact grammatical rules there or not. The difference that happens between the acquired set of rules, which is being, over the period of time being taught by a different, let's say, direct or grammar translation method, and the thing that we are basically articulating, expressing in real-time scenario, that comes into the parallel factor. Coming to the next notion, obviously the language acquisition device there. I've already discussed about that LADs over the period of time that are given by the neurons. It's an innate facility. It's a cognitive domain there that exists, that generates stimuli there. Now, I'll give you one very brief, experiment to prove my point. Have you ever wondered when you start speaking the very word pen? Who has taught you that something which has a step on it, with which we can write, is called, let's say, as pen? Now, again, I'll give you another example to prove my point. Now, I'll giving you my example into that. Let's say my L1 language is Hindi, but still, whenever I see a pen, I always start thinking the same way in terms of, let's say, in our cognitive domain as pen rather than as kalam, which we use in Hindi. Why? Most of the times when we are acquiring our languages, the cognitive domain by default dissociate the exact meaning which has been articulated in the L1 language and use and transpose it to the L2 languages. Have you ever wondered how many times we use, or let's say we articulate English languages in different L2 languages? Even let's say in the example of, let's say, Hindi. I did a very brief experiment in my student days, where in my alma mater in BHU, we have a student exchange program there, and we have students from different nations, from Europe and from US. And I got a very witty reply from one of the students from the US. He was from Connecticut, and he said, even if we don't know, let's say, your Hindi language, still we are able to comprehend what you are talking about. Because most of the times the meaning, the exact meaningful word, the articulation which you speak, or let's say the entire meaning word which you are basically carrying out in order to transfer your information, that you speak in English. Now suppose if tomorrow if I want to take the board a train, obviously I'll take it. Okay, I'm late for my train. Obviously I have to board it. You won't use the exact Hindi articulation of the word train. That's how the dilution theory works in language, and even in the pedagogy theory. It's an innate part of our cognitive domain where we, by default, because of, let's say, cross-cultural influences, is beyond our norms, beyond our articulations. And even there comes the rules of cultural evaluations also associated with it. If you just closely observe into your entire society, how many of you find will articulate in a proper prescribed grammatical rules of, let's say, animal language? In my case, let's say about Hindi. We always dilute it, we mispronounce this. But the meaning get conveyed. That becomes the most fundamental factor.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Would it be possible for you to use an earphone or a mic?
Yeah,
There's comments on YouTube, and they're asking you that the voice is very low.
okay. I'm using a microphone, but still, I'll try to speak a slightly louder.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So most of the times, what happened in terms of, let's say, language acquisition device, or let's say the use, or let's say the articulation which we are using, these notions comes into play. And one of the very fundamental notions whenever you are articulating, or whenever you are, let's say, using those notions, the fundamental factors comes into play is the rule of dilution theory in terms of English language, the lang and parole which we have discussed, in terms of, let's say, L1 language what we have discussed, in terms of, let's say, how the syntactical structures comes into play. All those notions plays a very prominent role there. Now, till right now, what we have discussed about in terms of, let's say, in terms of basic components of language, how we have language, how even language comes into play, why we language need even at the first place. And I give you the example that, okay, in order to communicate the language, you always have 4 to 5 different components. You have a sender, encoder, medium, channel, let's say receiver. And obviously, in all those notions, the very fundamental factor that comes into play is the role of, let's say, the encoder. That's comes the rules where the language comes into play. In any form of information, in any form of data transmission, in any form of, let's say, verbal or non-verbal communication there, the encoding comes into play, and that's where the rules of language comes. Be it L1, L2 acquired language, or let's say in terms of, let's say, Pidgin or Creole, or any jargons that you use. Basically, what you're doing that you are encoding that information there. And that's the role of entire format. In terms of language acquisition device, we over the period of time in the entire lecture will be discussing about different components: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, the LEDs, the lang and parole, the grammar translation method. We'll be discussing about the detail about the grammar translation method, and obviously the direct method theory also associated with it. The very fundamental in terms of that also comes the role of tone, pitch, and intonation there. That's the very common factor in terms of, let's say, in terms of language theory or pedagogy or English and use when we are discussing about those notions. How these factors comes into play. Now, suppose if I just start using the word, the very fundamental word, if I just say, suppose you just ask your friends, just give me a pen, and you just use in a very different articulate manner, just give me a pen. The entire syntactical structure remains the same. You just raise your tone, and the entire meaning got changed. In terms of, let's say, LSRW, when we are discussing, why we always have a notion that the speaking has a different notions, the tone, the emotions, the valuations associated with it. While at the same point of time, texting always have, or let's say in terms of, let's say, description, or let's say in terms of, let's say, writing, is always is bound by the notions. At least you can't express your emotions out of that. Have you ever wondered why all the entire notion, let's say, why we need emojis or icons at the first place? If you have a very, if you've been studying linguistics for a period of time, you must be knowing about the importance of icon, index, symbols there. Why we need all those factors? Why we need these icons, index, symbols at the first place? If we are able to communicate the entire information, let's say in the L1 language, by the same notions, let's say by the L1 language, the syntactical structure, the rules, the grammar that we are having, then why we need it? All these plays a very important role in terms of the syntagmatic structure, paradigmatic structure, the synchronic structure, and as well as the diachronic structure of language. It's always keep on evolving over the period of time. If you put a very key emphasis on the notion that suppose the way basically the East Midland dialect, or let's say in which the modern English has been evolved over the period of time, the Chaucerian English which we speak, the Shakespearean English we speak, or let's say during the period of time, during the Restoration ages, how it has been evolving, changes over the period of time, and how it's been, gained the loan words that we've been using over the period of time. The word avatar, obviously it's a loan word. I'll give you an example. Let's say in Russian, there's a word, let's say, dwer, that comes from the Hindi word dwar. So all those notions about different loan words, the accusations, let's say different tones, pitches, all comes a very, intact structures of the syntactical structure in terms of L1 languages. Then comes the rule of pitch. Now, there I need your slight, concentration on that. In terms of, let's say, tone, pitch, and intonation, there's a slight variation into that. Most of the times, often in the UGC net examinations, the questions are often being asked in terms of assertion and reason questions. Let me give you an example. The technicalities in terms of cracking the UGC net JRF examination. It's always never the questions that makes a question very hard. It's always the options, the 4 options that makes the questions very difficult. Most of the times, even my students always keeps on saying that obviously the 4 options looks very familiar, the similar. And most of the times in the recent sense, when the NT is conducting the examination, the linguistic factor, or let's say in terms of basic English pedagogy, or let's say English and uses, is often been asked in terms of assertion and reason questions. That's not a very straightforward question now these days they are asking. So you always have to have your basic concepts very clear. In the examination, most of the times people get confused with the notions about the tone, the pitch, the intonation. It's all about when it comes to the pitch, it's all about the perception of your voices, about your higher or lower frequencies, at which your ear is basically transcribing, decoding your entire information, which I said at the very first place in terms of, let's say, whenever you are encoding, let's say sender, encoder, medium of channel, and decoder. Now, I'll give you one more example to prove my point there. Now, suppose I'll give you a hypothetical situation. If, let's say, encoder and decoder are at two different levels, will the meaning, will the communication will be conveyed? Obviously not. Now, suppose if I start articulating in a Russian language, and let's say the entire audience is not comprehending or not competent enough to understand the Russian language, obviously the encoding and the decoding is at two different levels there. So these notions come, obviously the encoder and the decoder must be at the same level, at the same cognitive domain there. And obviously the pitch also rolls into the play in terms of, let's say, articulation. And obviously at the last is the intonation. It's the matter of variation of the pitches in the voice. How frequent, how lag is there, and how often accompanied by the stress, the rhythm. You always have the notion about the stress syllable, the unstressed syllable, the iambic pentameter, tetrameter, hexameter, alexandrine. All these notions comes into play. So over the period of time, when you are acquiring, let's say, tone, pitch, or intonation, or the valuations, these factors comes into play whenever you are acquiring, let's say, L1 or L2 language or pedagogies and users. You always have the notion even associated with how you acquire your languages at the first place. I've already given you the example that obviously in terms of acquiring the language, you always have a notion, the cultural affiliation, your kith, your family, your kins always comes into place. That's the first fundamental things. After that, then you acquire from the institutions, from the schools, the universities, and obviously subsequently so on and so forth. But even in that notion, there's a catch into that. In how multi-diverse environment you are living on. So over the period of time, when you are acquiring these languages, these formations, these valuations, these tone, pitches, and intonation do plays into roles. And obviously, subsequently over the period of time when you are acquiring these notions, obviously have that affirmation into the mind that whenever you are acquiring any languages, any formations, the rules of the syntactical structure, the synchronic structure, the diachronic structure, basically the grammatical rules, the tone, the pitch, the tone, intonations, even syllables. Have you ever wondered if you watch, let's say, any dramatic act, or let's say any poetry recitation, there's a proper rhythm associated with it. They knows where to stress, how much to stress, at which point of time in acquiring all those languages. Or let's say, in terms of, let's say, whenever we are using any language, suppose if I started using or start lecturing you the entire lecture in terms of, let's say, basic fundamental plain tone, obviously you won't be able to comprehend at which point of time I'm putting a key emphasis. You always have a notion there. These are very innate general quality in terms of, let's say, whenever you are acquiring, let's say, you are having those notions associated with it when you are attempting in terms of UGC NET JRF examination. Let me give you again an example. Most of the times in the NET examination, the question has usually been asked in terms of assertion and reason, where you, most of the times, the statement, there's a assertion, there's a reason, and you have to give them the 4 options. So if your fundamentals are not clear in terms of, let's say, language acquisition, album language, linguistic structure, code switching technique, pidgin, creole, jargons, you always have tough time decoding the entire information. Earlier, usually the notion was very straightforward. And let me give you one other example. Most of the time in terms of English and use or in the pedagogy, you always can't study in a bifurcation. You always have to have that linguistic factor intact in that role. The linguistic component, the transcription, the phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, code switching technique. All those notions plays a very prominent role there. So subsequently, before, in order to have a notions where you have a tone, pitch, intonation, or basically in terms of, let's say, the variations, the rhythm in the pattern, these notions will be there. But in order to understand, in order to have a notion, or let's say even in terms of uses in English, even we are bound by the times constraint, but otherwise I'll have a very keen interest in terms of how even English language has acquired over the period of time, let's say in the Indian subcontinent. The emphasis, the cultural valuation associated with it. Obviously, there's some kind of cultural valuation when you speak English in terms of the other language when you are speaking, let's say L2 and L3. What's the role of cognitive domain there? So these notions plays a very prominent role whenever we are dealing with the notions, let's say in terms of acquiring languages, in terms of having notions associated with it. But these roles play. This is the entire slide which basically I was discussing the notions. Subsequently, over the period of time and while wrapping my entire lecture, one more thing that I to have a key emphasis on the notion is that, let's say, whenever you are having an English language in mind, or let's say language acquisition in mind, or let's say the uses, the syntactical structure, the grammatical structure in rules. First thing, be very clear with the notion of the fact that these things are interacted with one another. The language barrier, the language association, the linguistics component, the linguistics features, how language has been evolving. I think we all can fundamentally agree with this notion, with the fact that language is always very dynamic in nature. It's live. Now, suppose for tomorrow onwards, the entire structure, let's start speaking, stopping English language, there will be no cultural valuation or affiliation associated with the English language. The component, the feature, the importance, the valuation of one particular language is always associated with the fact that how well reciprocated has been accepted in the entire society. We all can fundamentally agree with this notion that English is no longer a foreign language. It's a global language now. It's doing each and every, wide area of the domain. But in order to acquire any languages, in order to have any notions, in order to have technicalities, you have to first understand the basic components of the grammatical rules, the syntactical structure, the grammar associated with it. Over the period of time, we've been discussing about these notions, about language acquisition, about different 5 components, about even language transmission. Now, whenever you are using, or let's say articulating any word, the very first notion basically associated with how well you are, how clearly you are articulating it, at which point you are putting key emphasis on which notions, at which point of time. Now, if I start delivering the entire lecture in a plain, blunt tone, obviously you won't be able to understand at which point of time I'm putting a key emphasis to have a notions associated with it. Now, to prove my point, I'll give you a very brief example of it. There always must be a very fundamental difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is an inherent quality that you're born with, whereas listening, you put key emphasis on those notions. So even in terms of acquiring those languages too, obviously there is some kind of fundamental cognitive domain attention that you're basically putting on. That's the most fundamental idea associated with it. So in terms of acquiring, let's say L1 language, or let's say L2 languages, or let's say in terms of having the syntactical structure, or the challenges that you are having in terms of, let's say, language lab, code switching technique, or let's say in terms of the loan words you are having it. You'll be surprised in English language we have multiple loan words. How we have acquired it, especially in the terms of, let's say, globalization, we are using it one way or the another. Avatar obviously is a loan word there. You're using it. That's the importance of cross-cultural valuation in this language. Any language can't be segmented, bifurcated, desegmentalized, alienated into one separate genre. It can never was, it will never be done. It always has exposure to different domains, different structure, different rules. The articulation, the valuation associated with one particular language will always be associated with a social valuation associated with it. And there comes the role of dialect also into that. If you've been a keen observer, obviously you know that there's a different tone, accent associated with it. We have a Cockney accent there. John Keats is considered to be the most important writer associated with the Cockney English. Even in terms of, let's say, in terms of your original languages, let's say even in any language, L1 or L2, any languages you have, we always have a dialect associated with it. In my case, let's say in Hindi, we have different, we have Braj, we have Khadi Poli, we have Angika, we have Mathli, we have Maghi. All those different dialects associated with it. How it's developed at its first place. Obviously, we all can fundamentally agree with this notion that obviously we have acquired one simple rules in terms of, let's say, Hindi or English languages. Obviously, the fundamental rules of English or Hindi grammar that we have acquired in our school days. But how all those tones and dialects have over the period of time been evolving, and the people are more comfortable in speaking their own dialect and tone. Now, suppose tomorrow onwards, if I start having some kind of fabricated tone associated with it, let's say in terms of, let's say, even English language, I can't do that. Obviously, the tone, the valuation, let's say in terms of affirmation or the acquisition that we have in terms of, let's say, English language, obviously, terms will be Indian in innate tendency. I can't evolve it. I can't change it. It's always have a tone of that asset that is associated with it. And you must cherish that notion. But it's still, in order to acquire those languages, those skills, those valuations, you all have to have a very clear concept notion about how language evolved, what is the use of language, why we need language even at the first place in terms for the encoding or for the transformation of information of data. And then obviously, once you have acquired those skills that, okay, for the encoding, you need some kind of particular languages there in order to transmit the data, then obviously you need, okay, there are different components of language transmission that you need to abide by that. And even in terms of communication also, that's a very different genre, but there are different types of communication in terms of any languages you go. You have a linear communication there, you have a group communication there, you have a chain communication there, cluster communication is there. Then you obviously have a probability chain communication there. There are different notions associated with the different, irrespective of the languages. While keeping those, let's say, all those rules or communication skills associated with any language, you have to embellish all those grammatical, syntactical rules of the language which you are speaking. Now, suppose you have understand that obviously you need a sender, encoder, decoder, and obviously then you have a receiver, and then probably you can have the feedback. So for that encoding, again, you need a certain set of rules for, let's say, for the L1 language. Again, you need some certain rules. You have to have a notions associated with the sounds of a one particular language, let's say phoneme, then you combine it to form some kind of meaningful word, that is morphology, then you combine into some kind of simpler sentences, then you become, syntax, then you again form into a literal meaning, that is semantics, and then you go beyond the literal meaning, that is pragmatics. And even how you acquire even all those languages at the first place. There are two, that is direct method and the grammar translation method. Have you ever wondered how you, like, let's say, suppose if you are in your college days, or let's say you are planning to acquire L2 language, let's say Spanish, or let's say French, or Russian, or German, or Arabic. There are two very fundamental ways to acquire, that is direct method and the grammar translation method there. The grammar translation method is a very old school, but it's very reliable there. Obviously, it's a slightly time taking, but still the notion exists there. Is the fact is that suppose you want to change the thing, suppose you want to have that notions associated with it. First, you acquire, or let's say observe those language, you learn, you mug up the entire vocabulary skills. What's the most challenging things in terms of acquiring the L2 language? The vocabulary. Obviously, because the thing which you are basically articulating, thinking, having those notions which you want to express, obviously is you are thinking in your L1 language here. But once you acquired it, once you have that notion, you first translate your thoughts, your ideas, your object from your L1 language to the L2 language there, and then you do it. So via translating, via those notions, prescribing those forms, or let's say evaluations, those ideas, those objects which you have in terms of your L1 language, we're just again reconverting into your L2 language with a particular kind of simple, let's say, vocabulary terms. And then you will start embellishing all those words, those grammatical rules of L2 language, and then you start speaking it. That comes into role. That's the most fundamental terms in terms of, let's say, English and rules. And then we obviously have a direct method where you start thinking about those objects directly in terms of your L2 language. There you can reduce the aspect of, let's say, in terms of affirmation, or let's say the valuation associated with it. So these plays a very important role. I sum up my lecture with these notions. I open my sessions if you have over the YouTube channel. If you have any queries, if the student have any questions, if they have any doubt, feel free to have that dialogue via our host, so that we can have that notion associated with it. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your instructions and very enlightening words. It was a very great session on language and its origin. So now to summarize the topic for today, Mr. Apurva Shahi discussed about how language and its origin and how language acquisition involves structures, rules, and representation works. And also discussed about the difference between pidgin and lingua franca. He also covered concepts of lang and parole and about the language acquisition device, how phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and how to have a extensive vocabulary are some necessary tools for a successful use of a language. So, thank you so much, sir. And before concluding the workshop for today, I would like to announce the schedule for day 11, which will be on Monday and divided in two sessions, which will be delivered by two speakers, namely Dr. Tippeswamy BM from Karnataka and Mr. Sukendru Das, Assistant Professor from Bankura University, West Bengal. And I would pass this host duty to Ms. Lakshmi Keshavani. I hope our attendees must have gained much needed insights regarding the same. And so, on the behalf of the students and B.N.N. College, I would like to thank Mr. Shahi for joining us in for the e-workshop today. Thank you so much and have a great night. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.